rise to wholeheartedly support the Crown Land Management Section 78B Leases Amendment Bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, it gives me great pleasure, after having travelled down to Innes National Park, which I realise will not necessarily be covered by this bill, but having travelled down to Innes National Park to meet the chair of the Shack Owners Association down there, Brenton Chevelle, discuss with him his desire to see his and his fellow shack owners achieve ownership of their shacks, the shacks that they've held in their family for some years, and this is an important first step in that direction. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to contribute to this bill, which pleasingly fulfils another pre-election commitment made by the Marshall Liberal government to create new opportunities for families with shacks on Crown leases on Crown lands and to retain their shacks in exchange for upgrading them to meet contemporary safety, amenity and environmental standards. It is noted, of course, as I just mentioned, that the Crown Land Management Section 78B Leases Amendment Bill impacts only upon leases on Crown land, of which in my electorate of Narungga there are, and I list them as follows, Mr Deputy Speaker: 7 around Marion Bay, 6 at Port Clinton, 3 at Dowker Bluff, 1 at Foul Bay, 1 at Hardwick Bay, 1 at James Well, 2 at Port Morawi, 1 at Pine Point, 1 at Point Suda, 1 at Sultana Point, 1 at Puddin Rock. I've never been to Puddin Rock. Off North Beach near Wallaroo, Mr Deputy Speaker. 1 at Webbling Bay in the Barunga West Council area, 6 near Port Broughton, and 30 at Fisherman's Bay, a wonderful community that Fisherman's Bay is. And finally, of course, in the Adelaide Plains Council area, there's 1 at Port Parliament and 2 at Middle Beach. Pleasingly, Mr Deputy Speaker, for these lessees and their connected families that have retained shacks for generations, this bill creates some certainty after many, many years of uncertainty. Knowing their shack under life tenure lease would face demolition upon the death of the last named leasee, and as such providing no incentive to maintain or invest in them, understandably left many to fall into a state of disrepair. Marshall Liberal government sees the benefits of these shacks that these shacks bring for holiday communities and for the environmental wellbeing and tourism value. So I welcome the announcement made straight after the 2018 election by the Minister for Environment and Water, the Honourable David Spears, placing a moratorium on the practice of automatically terminating leases upon the death of the last named leasee, and placing all pending revaluations of shack sites on hold, to allow valuable time to explore the issue of freeholding shacks on Crown land and look at renewable tenure options for shacks in national parks. The amendment bill before us, importantly, it removes the transitional provision, the legal barrier contained under the existing Crown Lands Act, that prevents the holder of a Section 78B lease from being granted a further interest at the site, such as better tenure or freehold or term tenure. It sets out a process, Mr Deputy Speaker, that provides options for existing leases that leasees currently don't have, where they can seek surrender of their existing lease in return for purchasing the land at market value or entering into a term Crown lease. The leasee may seek this for themselves or nominate another person to purchase or lease the Crown land. It is important to note that this amendment bill does not guarantee a leasee will be granted improved tenure, but it creates a pathway which will allow them to be considered for better tenure. At this point, I wish to stress that this bill is step 1 in this welcome reform process, that this amendment bill does not deal with shack leases within national parks, such as Innes National Park in the Narungga electorate, of which there are 20 shacks whose lessees are watching this debate today with great interest and have publicly and loudly welcomed the commencement of any legislative reform which will stop the necessity to demolish these generational family shacks. Dealing with shacks within national parks requires a separate process by the department which the Marshall Liberal government has committed to, which will follow the passage of the bill before us today, and of course which is required to amend the relevant park management plans as outlined in Section 38 of the National Parks and Wildlife Act before further reform can commence. This process involves a regulated minimum 3-month public consultation period yet to commence and consideration by several parties, including the Parks and Wilderness Council, and consultation and negotiation in the case of Innes with the Narungga traditional owners as future co-managers of the park. With a co-management agreement in place with the Narungga Nation Aboriginal Corporation, from there the new park management plan can proceed with a drafting and consultation process I'd expect will take another 12 months of work. But still, the progress of this first step amendment bill before the House today has been welcomed by all lessees on shacks, on Crown land and in national parks, even though lessees on the latter will still need to be patient for just that little bit longer. Shack owners in Innes National Park have been fighting for change for some 4 years or more now, with locally the most well-known case being the fight to save a family shack at Shell Beach in Innes National Park, known as Slogs Motel, which in 2015 became the first of the Innes shacks on the chopping block to be hit with forced removal. Under current legislation and the previous Labor government, and despite lobbying from the South Australian Shack Owners Association, family member representatives such as Mick Reynolds, who became the spokesperson for a large extended group of family and friends of the late Philip Pavey, the last leaseholder of the Slogs Motel, who died in 2014, this shack faced enforced demolition by 30 June 2015, and there was a large, loud public outcry about this decision. And from more than just the family of the lessees, Mr Deputy Speaker, a change.org petition was signed by 1,172 people, and similar support came from social media platforms. The online petition preamble was that the undersigned ask, and I quote, members of Parliament of South Australia to move to save the private shacks in Innes National Park as historically important places to the region, and, I further quote, support the call to save Slogs Motel to allow this family and future generations to preserve this important icon of the state and region so that future generations may enjoy the heritage and generations to come can see the humble beginnings of tourism in a place which has been since declared a national park. Noting the area now known as Innes National Park was gifted to the state government by the Innes family, who would never have intended for shacks to ever have been demolished. End quote. I add here, and it is alluded to in that quote, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Innes National Park, about 9,000 hectares in size, was first claimed in 1970, and its name does arise from the Innes family, who gifted the park to the government, and it is my understanding that the Innes family gifted the park with the proviso that the village of Inniston, which retains a number of heritage buildings, would always be allowed to remain, so one can take that to mean that the shacks were intended to remain there as well. Mr William Innes discovered gypsum in the area, which has been mined and exported since in the early 1900s. Online response comments of the day advocated that Slogs Motel is not a burden on any natural resource, not is it overly intrusive to the environment with native vegetation extending to and beyond the edges of the existing footprint of the dwelling. And more lamented the, and I quote, appalling treatment of existing lessees who pay exorbitant fees and look after such places. With shack lessees paying thousands a year in annual lease fees and council rates, the latter for scant services in return, and reportedly these rates were calculated on valuations of freehold sites in nearby towns, it is not surprising lessees have long been calling for reform. Back to the online petition, if I might, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was all to no avail, and as legislative requirements are just... It was all to no avail, however, as legislative requirements are just that. And the infamous Slogs Motel ultimately lost its fight, being demolished in 2016 after a long and lengthy fight to save it. To further demonstrate the depth of connection and feeling by local people on this issue, particularly from Southern York Peninsula, and the extent of effort to save it from the bulldozer, I now read from the local media of the day on 11 March 2015. A family shack at Shell Beach is expected to be the first of Innes National Park's iconic retreats to be demolished. For 63 years, family and friends of the late Philip Pavey have spent holidays at the shack known as Slogs Motel. Mr Pavey died late last year, and the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources is now bound to enforce its demolition under the life tenure shack lease agreement he signed in 2002. However, Mick Reynolds is working to save the building on behalf of the family and is not giving up yet. Mr Reynolds said he will continue to exhaust every avenue of appeal. He goes on to say, I'm doing this on behalf of Philip's sister, although as a part of the extended family group, I've been going down to the shack regularly for 46 years. Originally, when builder and owner John Slogs passed away in the late 1980s, the shack was left to his friends at Port Victoria, about half a dozen lads, including Philip and my father. Unfortunately, they were later told only one person could be on the lease, and that's when Philip became the leaseholder. The shack is not a permanent place of residence, nor a mansion worth $1 million. It's an iron dwelling with a wood floor and no electricity. If in the end we were forced to remove the shack, the dune it sits on would become a dust bowl very quickly, doing more damage to the environment than we have ever done. End quote, Mr Speaker. An important point indeed as we progress the bill before us today. The media article continues. Slogs Motel is expected to be the first of the Crown lease shacks within Innis, including the first of the Crown lease shacks to go within Innis, including at Pondalowie, Dolphin Beach and Inniston. Despite an ongoing fight, currently shacks must be pulled down by their owners' estates at considerable expense once the last person on each property lease dies. If only, Mr Speaker, if only they'd had the Marshall Liberal government moratorium on the automatic termination of shack leases in place as we do now, to allow for the underway shack review process that has been provided since April last year. They would provide families with confidence that they can continue to at least occupy the shack in the event of the death of the last leasee until such a time as they are assessed for the suitability for longer tenure. If such a review is underway, then under the previous government, the local iconic Slogs Motel may well still be standing to be enjoyed by future generations of locals and visitors. At the time, a valid argument from the Innis Park Shack Owners Association, who joined the fight and worked with the department to explore options for the future to secure tenure for all shacks within Innis. At the time, the argument was that the Shell Beach Shack in particular has provided benefit to our local community over the years by allowing many local schools and community groups to utilise the shack, and that we hope these aspects are able to be taken into consideration by the department when assessing the value of these buildings to the local area. So stated a local champion for the cause, Brenton Chevelle, at the time back in 2015, who I must note, Mr Deputy Speaker, is still today the chairperson of Innis Park Shack Owners Association. I've met with a number of times since being elected and prior to being elected, and I know he's following the passage of this bill very carefully and very attentively today. Mr Chevelle has publicly welcomed the commitment by those on this side of the House to provide a legislative pathway to retaining shacks in recognition of the roles they can provide in relation to long-term economic and tourism benefits, in this case for the YP region, and for the environmental benefits. When the moratorium on further demolition of shacks was announced in April 2018, local lessees described it, and I quote, as exciting times for shack owners in South Australia at the moment. And another quote, after years of being treated like second-class citizens by the previous Labor government, it is great to see our new government standing by its promises to embrace the shack's community. What a wonderful quote that is, Mr Speaker, about the support for this bill before us today. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, whilst to facilitate the retention of shacks located in national parks, additional amendments are required to individual park management plans. This separate process by the department is being advanced and will take due course while the moratorium on demolishing shacks is being maintained. Innis National Park lessees welcome the continued development of new policy and implementation that provides certainty of tenure and valuations of shack sites going forward. So to the bill before us today, I welcome it and gladly support it. It provides certainty of tenure for families by expanding the eligibility to maintain a lease in return for improving shacks to meet contemporary safety, amenity and environmental standards. More freeholding of shacks located on Crown land will follow as we will renewable tenure options for shacks located within national parks. Fair valuation advice for the sale of shack sites will come as a result, as will strengthen links between local rangers, Friends of Parks groups and shack owners. This policy work has been technically complex and has involved consultation with shack owners associations, traditional owners, the Conservation Council and Friends of Parks groups, as well as individuals and families, and dealing with a broad range of regulatory agencies and government departments, including the Environmental Protection Authority, the Coastal Protection Board, DIPTI and SA Health, as well as local councils. I heartily commend all involved in the extensive work undertaken. With presently 247 shacks in South Australia affected by Section 78B leases, this work is of vital interest to many. I stress the amendment bill before us does not guarantee that a leasee will be granted improved tenure, but it creates an important pathway to at least allow them to be considered for better tenure, be it for a longer lease or to freehold. It is stressed that any surrender of a life tenure lease will be on terms determined by the Minister. A demonstrated ability to meet the identified contemporary safety standards will determine a successful surrender, and that relevant issues at each site will differ depending on circumstances. It's also important to note that under this amendment bill, shack lessees will not be obliged to upgrade their shacks as a result of this process. Rather, they will elect to either participate all to remain on their current 78B lease. So in summary, Mr Deputy Speaker, whilst it's too late for some families who unsuccessfully petitioned the former Labor government to stop shacks demolition, I am pleased those who haven't been able to secure tender under the previous government have had respite since April last year from worrying about the uncertainty of when their long-held family shack may have to go. And now that this bill is before us, formally commences the pathway that will provide much-needed certainty for current shack lessees who have not had that they have not had previously. These people who get to be in their 70s, 80s and 90s and under considerable anxiety to hand their tenure on, they will get the opportunity to hand their tenure on to family members. A clear process will be provided by this bill to enable the ongoing tenure of shacks on Crown land and in due course, hopefully, in national parks. I thus commend the Crown Land Management Section 78B Leases Amendment Bill to the House and look forward to a speedy passage.
Before I call the member for McKillop, I would like to acknowledge